will, thank you. Oh, this is Friday, February 14, 15, 2008. Let me say this. This is a cohesive course of lectures. They go continually on, and they sort of, one follows the other. It's quite normal for people in philosophy to start off and be very confused at first. That's quite normal. I've seen that again and again and again, many years. It evens out eventually, and you'll find how practical it is. That's what you're going to find out. Something we may not quite get tonight, yet we may. Just a little thing, but that doctrine was looked at by Aristotle 25 centuries ago, and he saw the consequences that we can prove with utter infallibility there's life after death. We can prove that. We can prove the infinite gulf that lies between man and brute animals, for instance. We can work out exactly how many passions we have. I remember, I've forgotten his name now, one of the experimental psychology books I have, he says there are 102 passions. There are no more than 11. Aristotle saw that, St. Thomas saw that, and we'll see that. And we prove it. That's the point in philosophy. We prove things. We don't just give out opinions. So I'm saying these things tonight because there are a number of new people present. You'll find at first be a bit confusing, but it will pull together. And we'll have periodical flashbacks. We'll have them. With regard to the storm situation I mentioned, I forgot to finish that. I suppose I could put it on the computer. If something's terrible, some area that we got, suppose we had a snowstorm and ice storm or something. Well, no, we don't want people to have to come from Lockport and Canada, etc., etc. So we'll put it on the computer. So what we did is we introduced people to philosophy. We saw what philosophy is. I've laid it out as much as one can without spending a lot of time and a lot of pages and a lot of ink. So what I've done is I've set it out there that we've arrived at a definition of philosophy as certain knowledge of all things through the principles of reason, or in the light of the principles of reason. Certain knowledge of ultimate causes in the light of the principles of reason. I put those definitions in there, and one of the big diagrams on the first page shows how to find what we call a descending pursuit of a definition. Now these lessons will help you to learn to think properly. It'll help you to learn to see life properly. It'll bring happiness and greater certitude to you. I remember Woodbury was the greatest man I've ever studied under. I've been fortunate enough to study under the top men of this past 20th century. Geiger from Switzerland, Regis from Montreal, and I can remember receiving envious remarks from those studying at the Pontifical University of St. Thomas in Rome, which used to be called the Angelicum. Men from there, a priest friend of mine said, "My God, you're lucky to have had those masters." And they all saw that this brings a certain unhappiness in a way, because you see the problems of mankind. They're much greater than people realize. But then there's a deep, satisfying understanding of your own life and reality. Lots of various parts in philosophy will bring that satisfaction to you. So look over those notes, and I'll help you in anything I can. I've put them down to try and make it a little bit intelligible. And metaphysics is the heart of philosophy. For the professional philosopher, metaphysics is the science. For those who are not professional philosophers, philosophical psychology is the science. But the 5 sciences of philosophy all hang together. And you will gradually unfold in your own mind an understanding that goes deeper than you thought was possible. But it takes a little while. So the philosophical method we looked at. And that's something I want to emphasize at the moment. The philosophical method is this. We have a principle of reason. Then we have a fact. We'll be saying something about that tonight. We have a fact. And from the two, we get a conclusion which explains the cause of the fact. Every science is looking for causes. Every science is trying to explain causes in some way or another. So, philosophy is seeking ultimate causes. I said to a couple of people once after a meeting, I was a pharmacist and we're coming from a pharmaceutical meeting, and I said, something came up about murder, and I said, well, what's wrong with murder? Oh, it's wrong. Yeah, but why is it wrong? They had never bothered to think about it. What in the last analysis is the reason that murder is wrong? I've done the same with people who have been active against abortion. What's wrong with abortion? Of course it's wrong, but why is it wrong? What is the ultimate thing? That's what the science of ethics will ask, that question, and will answer it. But ethics depends upon metaphysics, which we're studying now. Every science depends upon metaphysics. Aristotle, in 25 centuries ago, Aristotle was the first to systematize any of these sciences. But they're not perfectly systematic because most of it is, pardon me, we think that most of what he wrote came after he'd given lectures, and it doesn't hold together as well as it'd like to. Then it took a man like St. Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century to really at last develop an understanding of metaphysics. And certain men like Alabanus wrote an absolutely systematic business, but it's taken, say, over the centuries, it's gradually built up and systematized. But the best man was in the 20th century, in my judgment, and that's Austin Woodbury. And I studied under him for about 20 years. I wouldn't let a class go without being there. He was a boy from a farm. His brother was a mathematical genius. He could multiply a dozen figures by another dozen figures, not even work it out. He'd just tell you the answer like that. He didn't know he was a genius. He had to be told. And then he rejected it. He said, everybody thinks like that, don't they?
Something like Rain Man.
Yes. Most of us have to have a calculator. But he just gave you the answer. Anyway, it's hard to say that. You see, John of St. Thomas in the 17th century, or 17 something, he systematized philosophy too. He systematized, and his 3 big volumes are beautiful. I was mad as heck as a friend of mine. He died and gave his 3 volumes to a fellow who already had them. Didn't give them to me. If I ever get up there, he better watch it. He'll get a spiritual punch in the nose. Anyway, so there's the philosophical method. All sciences arrive at causes. Philosophical sciences, the 5 of them, arrive at causes too, but the ultimate causes. And their method is to draw a conclusion from principles of reason, which we'll study, principles of reason, which are thrown, the light of those principles are thrown on judgments of fact. Principle of reason will illuminate the fact and then draw a conclusion. Just understand that much for the moment, and we'll see it in application as we go. So tonight, does metaphysics have any relevance today? By the way, that was the last thing I think we did, wasn't it? About the last thing. Something came from Great Britain, which a few people are a bit excited about, and have sent it to me on the computer. I can only read it once, but I had to read it about half a dozen times. They kept sending this to me. This man said what's wrong with Great Britain today is it needs metaphysics. It needs metaphysics. He said the conversion of Great Britain, and it needs converting from its demoralized state, its demoralized nation. It is a demoralized nation. It needs converting to something, at least to solid Christianity, and it needs to be done through metaphysics, said this very well-known wise man.
I think we're having that problem here too.
Oh, of course we are. You're right. Oh, yes, you're 100%. I agree 100% with you. So now, what I want to do to put it all in perspective is... We've never had this. We don't usually have this, do we? Wish we could turn that off somehow.
Volume control.
Anyway,
Maybe you have it.
what we're going to do, this is that what it is?
Yeah, right, the lights go out.
No, the lights are
No,
there.
that's not connected with the lights, I don't think.
Turn it
No,
right.
it's a-
Try it.
See what happens.
Now the heat will go off.
It's over here.
See,
It's there?
The heat's up there. Oh, box
see if
is-
that does it. Keep it turned down, we'll see if that does it.
You're in charge, Bert.
So we're going to do briefly to look at history, since already I've gathered some people that would be interested in that. Look at history of thought first, before we lunge into the science, to see what other men have said. It's a funny thing. This happened to me when I lectured at a teachers' college. I was brought into this teachers' college in Australia one time to give a lecture, and what did the other people say? They all want to know what the other side says. What did I say? She didn't know, but you want to see the other side. Smart little puppies, you know, and their mother's milk is scarcely out of them, as Shakespeare said, and yet they still want to know, what does everybody else say? They're frightened to have a position. I'd just proven something, I can't remember what it was now, to be honest with you. I'd just proven something, and they want to know, what would all the other philosophers say? How many years are you going to give me, I said. So, the concept of being and how it relates to reality. So first,
Could I just suggest that people, that's on page 7?
7
of
years.
your notes?
Yes, good, thank you.
You're keeping up?
Good. And so first of all, the ancient period. And by the way, there are the periods that philosophers generally divide history up into. You see, philosophy didn't start till ancient Greece in the 5th century BC. It didn't start before then. Or rather the year's 6th century, isn't it? 500 something. That's the ancient period. Then there's the patristic period, the father period as it's often called. It comes at 200 AD to 700 AD. Then the scholastic period, so-called. Then there's a period of decadence, the 14th to the 17th century, and the modern era, 17th to 19th century, and the contemporary period, 19th onward. So, the philosophers, as you'll see on page 8, you'll see a very complex diagram. This came from my old master, who I studied under for about 3 years or so in Montreal, Father Regis, an excellent man. Had a pet skunk, by the way, and I don't know whether that was to keep students away, but none of us went to see him. On that page, there's how men's minds work. They have some knowledge of reality, but they're ignorant of some aspect of it. So this caused them to wonder. There's a lovely little book written on wonder. Keane was the fellow's name, I think, if I remember correctly. I'd have to look that up, I don't remember now. It's years since I've looked at it. I have about 7,000 books in my house, and I sometimes have trouble finding something. So they have hope of overcoming the ignorance, and this leads them to making an inquiry, or inquiry as Americans say, a pronunciation I could never quite catch on to. So what happens is either they find the answer, or there are two answers. They come up with two answers. Now, when you've got two answers, you've got a problem. You don't have a problem till there are two answers. So we're going to study Parmenides and Heraclitus, those two men. They're in the very early days of Greece. Now, there's one way of overcoming a problem, and this has gone all through the history of philosophy. You can deny one, you've got two terms, two sets of answers, or two sets of data to reconcile. Now you've got a problem. But it's very common for philosophers who are just as dumb as other people who will deny one of these in order to save the other. That's a dishonest method in any science whatsoever. So you can deny one term to save the other. If you do that, you've got a limping system now, and it's erroneous. You come to a wrong conclusion. Now, or you could go the other way. You could suspend judgment. Or you could have doubt. You're afraid of being wrong. This can go in two directions. One, you go into utter skepticism. And boy, have I run into that over my short life of 105 years. You can go and become skeptical, accept nothing, be completely critical of what everybody's saying. So they're afraid of reasoning. You get students that way sometimes, and I remember when teaching about, they're saying, oh, but there are all these philosophers. If only I knew. Well, get down and read the damn things, and then you'll know. Like a priest friend of mine, a Dominican father, says, why the hell don't the clergy take a book out and read it occasionally? I said, I'm glad you said that. I wouldn't be game to say that. Some of my friends would clobber me for saying that. So, or you can go the other way. You can start and go into inquiry, or inquiry as I think you say. You can make a really sincere inquiry and keep trying. A friend of mine who lives in an Indian cabin up in the Lac de Deux Îles, I don't know what they call it in English, the Lake of Two Islands outside of Montreal. And he was an instructor in the Mi'kmaq language, etc. He's French Canadian, and he was struggling to try and understand philosophy. And he spoke to Regis, Father Louis-Marie Regis, and a first-class mind, wrote a big book on epistemology, and it's absolutely magnificent. Regis said to him, keep trying. Don't abandon it. Keep trying. You'll get there. But don't be afraid to listen to another person who says he can help you. Or there's another way we can go, right over the right side. You can harmonize the two terms to the problem. And this brings joy to the intellect. There's nothing more beautiful. I remember the day I really understood the proofs of the existence of God. It was about 100 years ago. I'll never forget the day I first grasped the nature of the proof. The real heart dyed in the wool section of it that brings home the understanding. So my friends, we start on this brief view of history. First, the earliest Greeks. Some said this is how they tried to explain reality, through myths, stories, etc. The Australian Aborigines have got it. Back in the dream time, they'd say. The North American Indians have got it. Shamanism. The soul goes wandering out at night, searching for the truth, etc. Lots of nations have these things. The native people in New Guinea, headhunters, yep. Cannibals, yep. Young man living near me in Sydney was eaten by one of them. He was 26 years of age. He and the 6 police officers he went out with. They explained with animism. They said everything's got a spirit in it. And they would, when they have the most magnificent gardens you've ever laid eyes on, I'm told. I've got pictures of it somewhere, of them. Magnificent gardens. And what they'd do is they'd pull up stakes. And the stakes, they would always recognize they'd have to take with them to the next garden. Why? Because the spirit of the stakes would not like it if they left them behind. Now, this is how they explain reality. People like that, through myths, etc. And the Egyptians, many gods. And they explained everything with respect to many gods. It's all written on there for you, on page 9. Now, the Egyptians, then, in this second point, and flooding needed to solve a lot of geometrical problems, agricultural problems. The Nile would flood, particularly in the lower Nile, not the upper Nile inland, but the lower, around near the delta, the mouth. And so what they'd have is a problem. Oh, well, my farm was here somewhere, I think. So they developed applied math. They were the first to do something like that, applied math. Then the Greeks got hold of this. And Pythagoras, for instance, was a follower of this. And then he developed it into a mathematical theory. So mathematics, properly speaking, was started by the Greeks. For the Egyptians only had applied math. So in order to solve where the farms were, to be able to measure, the Egyptians would have to measure out, and they'd draw triangles and squares and all this sort of thing to try and work out where your farm was and my farm when the flooding has ceased. But the Pythagoreans applied it differently. They said, for instance, everything, the essence of everything was number. Well, that's a lopsided view, of course. That's a perfect number. What you can do with it. You can divide it and divide it and divide it, and it's a perfect number. But 7, oh, that's an ugly number. He's a nasty rascal. You can do nothing with that. That's the way they reasoned. You can find these in the history of philosophy books like Cobblestone. I will do that one night. I'll prepare a nice bibliography for you. I have bibliographies, but they're too big. But I'll prepare a nice small bibliography for you. So if you want to read a bit more on those. So the Greeks became aware of the importance of numbers, which seemed to explain the world of reality. Pythagoras and the Pythagoreans, they saw numbers as the essence of everything, as I said. Then on page 9, A2, Parmenides and Heraclitus. They faced a problem. The problem was this. Man is one thing, yet what do I see in front of me? Many people. I'm using man in the generic sense, of course, to be a male and female. So I see a lot of people in front of me. So that's funny. How can man be one thing, yet it's many things? Tree is one thing, but there are many trees. How's it possible to be one, yet not one? Movement, change the same way. Cold water becomes hot water. Well, how can change be possible? Cold water's there, but now it's hot water. So that's one thing, yet many things. So it's really for them one and the many, and being and change were the same problem. They'd see it this way. Let me clean this water a minute. Cold water becomes hot water. That's a being, and that's a being. How can a being become a being? It's already a being. They weren't silly. They were bright men. And they saw this. My senses tell me there are many people in front of me here. My intellect tells me man is only one thing, dog's another thing, tree's another thing. There were the beginnings of philosophy. The first official philosopher recognized as a philosopher was Thales. Thales.
Spelled.
Thales.
Thank you.
There's a very interesting story about Thales. Thales was being laughed at for being a philosopher. The people say, I've had this said about me, oh, he's got his head in the cloud. One of my classmates, Marielle, in Montreal, said, Le monsieur australien a sa tête dans les nuages. The Australian gentleman has his head in the clouds. I showed the buggers I was the only one that finished the course fully. The only one in the class. Anyway, she was in another world. One day Father Voyer said, did everybody understand? And she said, no. He said, let's put it this way. You're the only one imprudent enough to say that. He said, put her back in her place. She was the tall, beautiful, dumb blonde. Oh, pardon me, ladies. Anyway, the philosophers have their heads to the cloud. So they said this about Thales. And Thales thought to himself, he got sick of being laughed at. And he said, I better teach these people a lesson. So he went and put, he was able to forecast the next season, growing season, what it'd be like. This is all recorded by Aristotle, by the way. So what he did is he decided to put a deposit on all the olive presses. Now, I've been all over Greece, and I've got pictures of myself picking up olives under the trees with Greek ladies and gentlemen. And they grow a lot of olives in Greece. So anyway, he put deposits on all the olive presses. He knew that next summer was going to be a bumper harvest of olives. So everybody had to come to him to get the olive presses. So he raised the price a little bit, made a fortune, fixed a whole damn lot of them. Another fellow who I think his name was Themistius, he did the same with the iron mines. He put a deposit on the iron. And Aristotle records that it's in his Politics, by the way, we recorded this. He uses this as an example to show that there is an honest and a dishonest way of earning their living. I published something with including these things. I researched Aristotle, researched St. Thomas, and found a similar thing recorded by St. Thomas. It's all right for, say, one person to go ahead and arrange for the rest of us to go to the theatre, as he says, but if he goes ahead and in some way impedes us by buying all the tickets and then raising the price, That's contrary to society, and it is contrary to the common good. That's an immoral action. I published that in a paper, The Two Faces of Capitalism. There are two things called capitalism. Most people don't know that. So Parmenides and Heraclitus, they went about it, we'll deal with this again later. They said to themselves, my senses tell me that there are many people. My intellect tells me that people, if you like, there's one thing. Heraclitus, who went into the greatest Hera, that's why I call you, I always remember it that way. Heraclitus said, my senses must be deceiving me. I'm sorry, my intellect must be deceiving me. Obviously, my senses see many mankind, many people. So I will deny what my intellect says. That was Heraclitus' answer. I put that all in here for you. Parmenides said, my senses must be deceiving me. I will accept what my intellect tells me. So there's philosophy, start of it. There are two different terms to the problem. Is man one or many? Parmenides said, it's one. My intellect tells me that. Heraclitus said, external reality is all many. My intellect is deceiving me. But when he looked at change, he went a little further. He said, my intellect must be deceiving me. He said, because there's no such thing as being. There's just a flow of beings out there. The essence of it is just fire. How he got that, I don't know. But that's what Heraclitus said. It's just all one big flow out there. There was another man a couple of 100 years ago who said something similar. His name was Hegel. And there was a fellow who followed Hegel, and that was Karl Marx. He thought that just matter was flowing, developing itself. Hegel thought it's just spirit that's developing itself. But the idea we've got to get out of this is just simply this. One man denied his senses, the other man denied his reason, his intellect. That's a wrong scientific method in any science whatsoever, but it's practiced enormously. So I've said all that for you. The term being, by the way, the term being comes from, it's something that's doing the be act, being. So the definition of a being is what is. Emphasis on the what. Now what about thing? Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, I misled you there. That was a slip of the tongue. Being is emphasizing the be, in other words, the is part. Thing is emphasizing the essence part, the whatness. A being is that which is, or what is. A being emphasizes the isness, the thing emphasizes the whatness. That makes it clearer. I've set that out for you there. So Parmenides and Heraclitus, from then on, philosophers set out, like Aristotle and all that came after them, all the great philosophers, tried to resolve the conflict between those two, senses and intellect. And there are men today who can't accept that there's such a reconciliation. But up to about the time of the First World War, practically the whole world was teaching Hegel's philosophy. In other words, it's all in here, I don't know what the hell's going on out there. Plato's solution. This is page 10. What did Plato? Now Plato's much more interesting. He's making an attempt to solve the problem. He said, my intellect obviously tells me something, and my senses tell me something. So he focused particularly on the intellect as stimulated by the senses. He taught a very interesting philosophy. There are men today who are Platonists. They follow Plato. And this is what Plato taught. In another world, there's something called man. In this world, there's Bob, Mary, Joe, and millions of others. My intellect is focused on that, but he never told us how. My senses tell me that this is there. He said, when I see Bob, I remember that before my soul came into my body, this is Plato, that my intellect was familiar with that. And when I come down here, I remember. He called this the doctrine of reminiscence. So he said, my senses tell me about this. And say, here is Joe, let's say. Joe's intellect's on that, his senses on this. He said that there is a thing called the demiurge. Demiurge, which made or implanted matter, imprinted matter with madness, imprinted Mary with madness, imprinted Joe with madness. In other words, he made model, this was the model, and all these inferiors were modeled after this.
Well, is that because knowledge is already there and it just has to be awakened?
Exactly. That's exactly what he said. It had to be awakened. He said, we had the knowledge of this in another life before my soul came into the body, you see? And so when I saw these, it awakened what was there. So we call that reminiscence. In other words, sort of reminding us, as it were, of what was there. Now, the demiurge, whatever it was, did the manufacturing. Plato was a very sincere, very ascetic man, a certain amount of mysticism in him, and he was sincerely trying to find out what was going on. And he thought what we really are yearning for is to get this other world. So there's a pure tree, pure man, pure dog. Somebody says, what about mud? Said to Socrates. See, Socrates was the master of Plato. And really, we don't know how much came from Socrates and how much came from Plato, because Socrates wrote nothing. You know, he was condemned to capital punishment, to be executed. He had to drink hemlock. And so don't put hemlock in your coffee, please. He says he had to execute himself, but he said, I will do it. The others wanted to help him escape, his fellow students. Because in those days, they didn't have classrooms like we have now. They'd walk around the street, talking and discussing things. So they're called peripatetics. It's all one word, but I'll separate it here. Patine in Greek means to walk. In French, modern French, we use the term pattes, les pattes. A dog's paws, a dog's legs are pattes. Man's legs are pieds, P-I-E-D. But in ancient Greek, patetics, they were called the patetics, and peri means around, like perimeter. So that's the Greek preposition for around. So they were called peripatetics because they walked around. When I was walking through a famous mosque in Spain, I thought of the great masters like Avicenna, who strolled along this, discussing with his fellows, discussing philosophy. You know, it's hard enough when we got it written down. How do these men do this without it being written down? Read one of the dialogues of Plato, and your head will get into a swim. And you say, those men had no books in front of them. In fact, Aristotle's stuff, it is, we think, was written after he gave lectures and just went on his memory, and some of his students helped him. In any case, they'd go around saying, there's a pure dog, and one of them said, what about a pure mud? Must be, yes, well, our teaching says there must be pure mud. They run up against a problem. Here's Joe. He is tall. Here's Ted. He's shorter. Here's Bob. He's the shortest. Here what he's saying is that Bob, Mary, and Joe participate in this perfection called man. So Ted is participating in shortness compared with Joe, but he's participating in tallness compared with Bob. How can someone be tall and short at the same time? That was a problem they saw in trying to work out the ideal knowledge. They call this the really real world. This is only the real world. This is the really real world. They ran up against problems like this and tried to solve them. Had difficulty, of course. It's quite interesting to read some of the stuff. Read the dialogues of Plato. Plato, Aristotle, these men go through phases. Aristotle, who's the student of Plato, Socrates, the master, then Plato, the master, then Aristotle, the master. And Aristotle went through 3 phases in his life. First, he was the Platonist, following Plato's teaching. Then he dropped that and he took on a biological phase in his life. Alexander the Great would send him plants, and particularly plants and some animals, I do believe, and he'd experiment with them, observe them and all that. And he went through the biological phase. Then he learnt a lot from those plants. He went through then in the properly Aristotelian phase of his life. And he developed his own doctrine. Likewise, Plato. You can read Plato's things. First, he's all the main speaker in all of his works is Socrates. Then as you get into the next phase of his life, they become long essays of his own, not so much Socrates. Men mature, men develop their philosophy, of course. So I think we've said enough about Plato, but men were trying to solve the problems and found great difficulty in doing that. So then we come to Aristotle. I'm not going to spend much time on Aristotle because we're going to do that, mainly Aristotle and St. Thomas, as we go on, because they were the more mature philosophers. But we'll just say this, a few things about him here. He saw the solution to this. He saw, you see, the others had great problems with regard to change, but he saw that there must be 3 things required for a change. Say, hot water. Oh, I'm sorry, I meant to make that cold. Be better. It's more dramatic to put it that way. Doesn't matter really. Cold, water becomes hot. Hot coffee, if you like. 3 things are required for change. One is there's a substrate of the change, which is common to both terms of the change. 2, some form, call it a quality for the moment if you like, some form is needed, or some quality, hotness. One is lost and one is gained. So 2 things. Matter is required, form is required, and potentiality for this. Potentiality. You can have plenty of things with form, but they've got no potentiality for what you want to do. Try taking a glass of milk and making a shelf out of it. Somebody once said I was the only person who could do things like that, but they saw so how my shelves are held up by beer bottles and things. Yeah. Anyway, so much for that. So Aristotle saw with the doctrine of potency and act. It's got the actual coldness, it's got actual hotness, or actual waterness. We call that the act. Actuality or actuancy, as some have said. Act is simple enough. And it's got a potency for this. Act and potency. This is our first introduction to those 2 terms. So, act and potency. He solved it with that. He was the first. And this manifests his genius, that alone. So there are 2 principles in everything. One which is common to both terms of the problem. That word term, I'll explain that a little bit. Here in the United States, you speak about a terminal, bus terminal. In Australia, we say terminus. Terminal is an adjective. Terminus is the noun. I don't understand how that came about. It's odd. But then, well, I've got used to hearing an old rooster being called a chicken. I never heard that till I came to North America. Well, I did hear it in comic strips or something like that, but where we come from, a chicken's a little thing like that. It goes cheep, cheep, cheep. Maybe because they buy them very cheaply, I don't know. So there it is, there's what Aristotle taught, that there must be these 2 principles. Or you could call them 3. You could call it matter, form, and the potentiality for that. So he says in one place there are 2 principles, another place he says there are 3 things required for a change. He saw that. And of course, it conforms with common sense. That's one of the things about sound philosophy, my friends. It conforms with common sense. I worked with a famous atheist, Kai Nielsen, in the University of Ottawa. Talk about common sense. I saw idiocy, that's what I'd call it, not common sense. And stuff written by Paul Kurtz of the University of Buffalo, etc. God. Yes, they are good men. They're real. Philosophers. Now, we come to, on page 11, Plotinus. These are famous Greek philosophers. There are 5 that I've selected, which are the usual 5 we focus on. And they were good men, very sincere men. You find that there was one man, by the way, and I can't remember who it was now, it was lost in the history books somewhere. For 30 years, he went past armed guards, crawled under a hole in a fence just to hear one of these great men speaking. He went every night for 30 years. What a brave man. He saw that how it was worth going for. So, the Plotinus, which was, you might say, the greatest of these in one respect, yet he wasn't in another. He laid the foundations for these, what are called Neo-Platonic philosophers. The new Platonists, we sometimes call them. And the influences I've drawn out on the page here for you. Plotinus was the first one, and Porphyry, the second one, is very famous for something he drew and in logic, and Proclus, very famous, these men. You can see the influences where the arrows are pointing there. St. Augustine, I left one arrow out, I think. St. Augustine influenced Pseudo-Denis too, the Pseudo-Dionysius. Now, Pseudo-Dionysius, there's an interesting story attached to that, which is worth telling. In the letters of St. Paul to the Romans, if I remember correctly, St. Paul refers to Dionysius the Areopagite. Areopaga is a sort of like the local municipal council or something. It's a local council. And so Denis was an Areopagite. You try to say that in French, by the way. Areopagite. Gets your tongue and twisted up. However, Raymond Klebanski is at McGill University. If he's still alive, I don't know. I met him in 1983 and I was thrilled to bits. He remembered me as his student. And he introduced me to some famous philosopher as his friend. I was really flattered that day. Anyway, that was the World Congress of Philosophers, 3,000 philosophers there. And he's an expert on Pseudo-Denis. And I was told that he had discovered who Denis was. Nobody knows to this day. He said, "Je n'en sais rien. I know nothing about it. I don't know who he is to this day. No idea." Yet I was told definitely he was on the track of it in Paris. Nobody to this day knows who he was, but he was the only man that St. Thomas Aquinas called the Great. Denis the Great. Wow, that's some accolade for anybody. So Denis was mentioned in the letter of St. Paul to the Romans as, I've forgotten why he mentioned it, but he mentions it there somewhere. You can see it for yourselves in the Bible. And this person, this mysterious person, apparently wrote these works, sufficient for St. Thomas to call him the Great, wrote these works, and he used the name Denis the Areopagite as a pen name. Well, it misled everybody. Everybody thought, oh, it must be Denis the Great. Pseudo-Denis, mentioned by St. Paul. However, when they looked into it in about the 16th century, 15th, 16th century, Germans had started to use certain methods in developing literary criticism. And there's 2 things they look for: internal evidence and external evidence. Now, the internal evidence is this: the Greek written that this man wrote this work in had never been used before the 5th century. It was sort of a modification of the ancient Greek. Secondly, he refers to monasteries, and there were no monasteries before the 3rd century. What the heck's going on here? Everybody says something's wrong. Thirdly, they then realized in those days writers were so few and far between, they'd mention each other in some particular, quote them or something like that in some particular manner. They refer to them. So what they did is nobody had referred to him before the 6th century. So what the heck? No mention about him. No monasteries existing in those days. So they now know that at the end of the 5th or 6th century he existed. When I was in the Institute of Medieval Studies, we had to take a special course from Raymond Klebansky, who's the world authority on that. The man I just mentioned I met in Montreal again. He remembered me as his student. So Plotinus tried to reconcile Aristotle and Plato, but he mostly admired Plato. There's a certain mystical attitude in him. And he described this hierarchy of beings, and on page 12 I've got it for you. Top of the page there. I'll put the main term on the board. Does anybody has not got the pages?
No page number on this.
Yes, they're mystified. I made sure all his page numbers were on them. That's strange.
Not up to 12. The numbers start with 13.
Why is that?
Must be mine
You know,
have
sir?
numbers.
Some do and some don't. I ran into this last year too, I remember.
12?
That's strange, isn't it?
You know, I think you sent it out a couple times, maybe that's why.
Oh, but I put the thing on before I even start to edit it. I put the letters.
Mine magically erased them.
Jenna's did too. She told me she had hers erased for some reason. I don't know what the cause of that is. I don't know enough about computers to
Are
be
you
able to say
on
it.
page 12 then?
Pardon?
Yes.
12, yes. And this is what these men remember. They weren't lucky enough to have great men before them like we have today. They were groping. So you find it a bit funny sometimes, the stuff they wrote. But you've got to remember, they were groping, trying to solve the things. I've thrown problems at people who have spoken to me about, nobody believes that, surely. You're looking at it from hindsight, I've said. And then I've thrown a problem at, well, solve this problem for me. They couldn't do it. First he said there's the one. It's ineffable. That's to say unspeakable, unsayable. You can't even say it. As soon as you've said it, anything about it, you've multiplied it. That's very reminiscent in a way, isn't it, of Christian teaching? In a way, not quite. If you said the one exists, now you've multiplied something in it. You've got the one, you've got the existence. That's how he saw it. That one is perfection itself. You cannot say, there was something I should have said with it would be good to mention it here, with Plato. He said, for instance, I didn't think it was necessary to put in the notes, but Plato said, man, tree, dog, all participate in the one. One time he called it the good. Another time he called it the true. Well, a specialist in this stuff, he was my professor in it, as a matter of fact, and I said to Monsieur Descartes, I said, does he mean God? He said, it's not fair to Plato to say that. We know he probably did mean that. But it's not fair to him to say that he said that, or he meant that. So he said, all these will participate, they're all one, they're all good, they're all true. So therefore, and then man is multiplied, tree is multiplied, as we saw before. Well now, Plotinus focused on the one. He saw it as one. And he taught a doctrine of emanation. Something is coming out of, or leading out of something, etc. And he said that coming from that is intelligence. With a little stretch of the imagination, you could see that the Blessed Trinity is reflected in this to a certain extent. Now remember, these people lived in the 3rd to the 6th century. And from intelligence comes soul. And from soul, well, it's probably I'm saying it wrongly, after soul comes matter. These all lead out from the other one. Matter they saw as an evil thing. Matter's a gross evil thing. They saw it. And he said that intelligence implies duality, When I'm understanding something, there's me and the thing I'm understanding. That's duality.
But God already told us his name.
Oh yeah, but you're looking at something these men didn't know about at that time, you see? We've got to be careful of that. So I think that's all we need to say about the Neoplatonics. The two greatest, of course, was Augustine and the other man, Pseudo-Dionysius. Proclus, by the way, a great work was written by him. A friend of mine did his doctoral thesis on that, and there's a lot coming out of that. But there was a little bit of copying going on too from some of those men. Now, A6, Pseudo-Dennis, I'm not going to say too much about him, but he's the only man that St. Thomas Aquinas called the Great. By the way, St. Thomas was taught by St. Albert the Great. I stood next to his sarcophagus in the church of St. Albert the Great in Cologne one bitterly cold day. In fact, I went into the church to get warm, and next thing I see, reading it had written up somewhere in German, of course, down in the crypt was the St. Albert. I felt very small against that, standing looking at that sarcophagus, very small. Big stone thing it was, and it was raised about that high off the ground. And I felt like an ant looking up at a mountain, to say that the man that in his own lifetime was called the Great was St. Albert the Great. In his own lifetime was called that. He had such a vast learning. And there are things today that we accept that he taught. I'm very proud to say I've got a lot of his works in Latin, of course, a pile of at home, his works in logic particularly. He's a great master. And St. Thomas went after him, studied, I think, in Naples, and then went to join him in Cologne, in Germany. And the students used to call St. Thomas because he's a big man, not a heavy man as he's often portrayed to be, and not a sissy little thing like the cards they sell down at the shrine of Our Lady of Fatima here. Oh God, he's so saintly, his butter wouldn't melt in his mouth. Oh, I'll bring a picture in that a Jewish woman painted in Australia, and it was painted after much research. I'll bring that in to show you. In fact, a black and white one, which I've got, I don't know anybody else that's got it. We could get copies run off if you were interested. And he was a massive fellow. Took 6 fellows of his brothers to hold him down on one occasion when they tried to kidnap him on the mother's orders to send him back to the Benedictine monastery rather than go with the Dominican fathers. Anyway, that's another long story, I suppose. But St. Albert the Great was called the Great. Yet, in spite of that, he believed in unicorns, as I said the other night. Well, we don't know why. What were they? There were rhinoceroses in Europe then, and there were men on horseback with armour and horns on the horses' noses.
Where did he come from?
Who?
St. Albert.
St. Albert, Cologne, Germany.
Huh?
And anyway... Germany, yeah. So St. Thomas is the Prince of Philosophers. I think we're going a bit over time, I'm sorry. We'll stop there for the moment, have a break, and then we'll come back. We turned over now.